Chapter 7 Big Trouble in Little Rock. The Montgomery bus boycott made Martin Luther King famous. People all over America began to talk about the young black minister who had organized it. But King knew that Montgomery was only the beginning. Black people had won their fight in Montgomery, but it was not the only fight that they had to win in the South. To win their civil rights, black people needed to organize themselves. In 1957, hundreds of Southern black church leaders met together to talk about what to do next. At the meeting, King said that black people had to work together to win their civil rights. The church leaders organized themselves into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Martin Luther King became the president of the SCLC. He told them that they had to join together to fight for the rights of black people in the South. King wrote a book, Stride Toward Freedom, to explain his ideas. In his book, he talked about the teachings of Gandhi. King believed that nonviolence was the only way to win the fight for black rights. In Montgomery, the boycott had been nonviolent. The police had beaten the protesters, and they had tried to break the boycott by violence, but the protesters had not fought back. They had no sticks or guns, and they had not fought violence with violence. They had just refused to let people treat them unfairly, and they had won because they were right, not because they were violent. There were many other things in the South that needed to change. Schools were segregated. White children went to all white schools. Black children went to all black schools. Although there were more black children than white children in the South, much more money was spent on white schools than on black schools. But in 1954, the law was changed. Now, it was against the law to have different schools for black children and white children. The new law said that all schools had to take both black children and white children. Change came slowly to the South. Many white people hated the new law, and in many southern states, they refused to obey it. Arkansas was one of these states. In the state capital, Little Rock, 9 black students tried to enter the Central High School at the start of the 1957-58 school year. Little Rock soon became one of the most famous places in the story of the fight for civil rights. On the 2nd of September, the night before the start of the new school year, the leader of the Arkansas government, Orville Forbes, ordered the National Guard to stand outside Central High School. He told them to stop any black students from entering the school because he was afraid of trouble from protesters. The school was closed. But a judge said that Forbes could not use the National Guard to do something that was against the law. On the 23rd of September, the Little Rock police took the 9 black students into Central High. A crowd of more than 1,000 white people tried to stop the black students from entering. The crowd rioted and attacked the police. The pictures of the riot were seen all over the world, and many Americans were shocked to see such ugly attacks in their own country. Next day, the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, ordered the army to Little Rock. 1,000 soldiers stood in front of the crowd as the 9 black students entered Little Rock Central High School. Every morning, the 9 black children walked to the school. And every morning, the soldiers protected them as they walked through crowds of angry whites. One of the Little Rock 9, Elizabeth Eckford, later talked about that walk past the angry crowd. I looked for a friendly face in the crowd. I saw a nice-looking old woman. She seemed to have a kind face. But when I smiled at her, she spat at me. Inside the school, things were different. Ernest Green, one of the 9 black students, remembered the friendly white students who helped him. I missed 3 weeks of school, so I was behind in my classwork. A couple of boys in my class gave me notes on the lessons that I'd missed. After seeing the crowd outside the school, I was really surprised by this. Chapter 8. A New Start? For black people in America, 1960 was an important year. King was busier than ever. He decided to move back to his father's church in Atlanta. He spent half of his time working in his church and the other half working for the SCLC. King's policy of nonviolent protest was becoming more popular. Soon black people found a new way to protest: the sit-in. Restaurants in the South were still segregated. One day, in February 1960, 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, walked into a shop called Woolworth's. There were hundreds of Woolworth shops across the country, and many had restaurants inside the shop. The students sat down at a table and politely asked for lunch. The waitress refused to take their order and told the students to go, but they refused to leave the restaurant. Instead, they began a sit-in. They sat at their tables and waited until the restaurant closed. Next day, some more students joined them. Then, some white students joined the sit-in too. The Greensboro students were arrested, but the sit-ins did not stop. Soon, there were sit-ins at restaurants all over the South. More white students from the North traveled to the South to join the sit-ins. In July 1960, Woolworth's finally agreed to let both blacks and whites use their restaurants. Other big companies did the same. So once again, nonviolent protest had been successful in the battle for civil rights. Martin Luther King joined the sit-ins. When students held a sit-in at an Atlanta restaurant in October 1960, King stayed with them. He was arrested and put in prison. King was not sorry to go to prison. Like Gandhi, he believed that you should not obey a bad law. If the law is unfair, he argued, then it is right to break it. It is better not to obey a bad law than to obey it. If this means that you go to prison, then you have to accept that. King was not afraid of prison, but King's family and friends were afraid for him. They knew that King's life was in danger in prison. He had many enemies, and there were people who wanted to kill him. In the South in 1960, it was not difficult to kill a black prisoner. Coretta King went to John F. Kennedy for help. Kennedy had already said that segregation was a bad thing, and he promised to help King. When Kennedy asked the judge to let King go, the judge agreed. But Martin Luther King later went to prison many more times when he refused to obey unfair laws. 1 month later, in November 1960, John F. Kennedy became President of the United States. Across the country, people were full of hope. The young president promised a new start. Surely this must mean the end of bad laws and freedom at last for Black people in the South. But most white people in the South still did not want change. They were ready to fight to keep their way of life. There was a road to freedom, but it was not short, and it was not easy. Chapter 9. From Birmingham to Washington. 1963 began badly for the SCLC and Martin Luther King. He had had success in Montgomery and Greensboro, but now, for the first time, he failed. The SCLC tried to end segregation in Albany, Georgia. They fought against the town government and the police for almost a year. But at the end of the year, Albany's schools, libraries, and parks were still segregated. King had lost in Albany. Now he needed to win somewhere. He started to think about Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was one of the worst cities in the country for Black people. It was sometimes called Bombingham because there had been so many bomb attacks on houses and churches in Black neighborhoods. There had been 18 of these attacks in the last 6 years, but no one was ever arrested for them. The chief of the Birmingham police was a man called Bull Connor. When the SCLC organized protests in Birmingham, Connor's policemen beat the protesters and attacked them with dogs. Hundreds of protesters were hurt, and hundreds were arrested. King was one of the protesters who went to prison. When he was in prison, King read that some white church leaders had called for an end to the protests. They said it was not the right time for protests. King was angry when he read this. He wrote a letter to the white churchmen. In it, he said, "You say it's not the right time to protest. You say wait. For years I've heard the word wait. For too many years, Black people have waited. Too often. Wait means never." There was a problem with the protest. When men and women were arrested and put in prison, they often lost their jobs. It was difficult for Black families when their fathers and mothers were in prison. "Why not ask young people to join the protest?" King said. Plenty of school children wanted to join the protesters in Birmingham because they wanted to help. Freedom was as important to them as it was to their parents. Some Black leaders were worried about this plan. "These young children will get hurt when the police attack," they said. But King's reply was, "Segregation will hurt them even more." On the 2nd of May, 1963, 50 children aged from 6 to 18 marched to the center of Birmingham. They were arrested and put into prison. Then another 50 did the same. They were also arrested and put in prison. Then another 50. Then another. By the end of the day, 1,000 children were in prison. Birmingham's prisons were full. At first, the police were too surprised to do anything. But next day, they came with police dogs and powerful water hoses. Men, women, and children were knocked down by the power of the water and attacked by the dogs. When the protests were shown on television, the violence of the Birmingham police shocked many Americans. Black people were attacked by police just because they wanted the same rights as white people. People all over the country knew that this was not right. They knew that things had to change. And people in other countries were shocked too. How was this possible in a country like the United States of America, the land of the free? People began to ask questions about freedom in America. Was it only for white Americans? What about Black Americans? Birmingham agreed to stop segregation in its schools and on its buses. King had won the battle. Later in the year, he had his finest moment. In the summer of 1963, President Kennedy tried to get a new civil rights law. Civil rights leaders organized the biggest protest march of all to support the president. They wanted people from all over the country to go to Washington, D.C. and ask for equal rights for Black Americans. On the 28th of August, 1963, more than 250,000 people came to Washington and marched to the Lincoln Memorial. There were speeches and songs. Finally, Martin Luther King stood up and made the greatest speech of his life. "I have a dream," he said. In the America of his dream, blacks and whites were equal and lived together in peace. The speech was shown on television all over the world. People cried when they heard King's words. Surely things must change now, they thought. The country was full of hope for the future. But later in that year, 1963, America was once again shocked by terrible violence. Chapter 10. This Country is Sick. A month after King's Washington speech, there was more violence, again in Birmingham, Alabama. A bomb was thrown into a black church, and 4 young black girls were killed. King's message did not change, but the bomb made it harder to persuade people that nonviolence was the answer. On the 22nd of November, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, Texas. King had known Kennedy well and worked with him. They had argued about the best way to win equal rights for blacks, but they had agreed that equal rights for all must come soon. Like most Americans, King was shocked by Kennedy's death. "This country is sick," he said. Sometimes he thought about his own death. Perhaps somebody hated King enough to kill him too. He wondered about the new president. Lyndon B. Johnson came from the South. What was his policy on segregation? Did he want to end it, like Kennedy, or to continue with it? Nobody knew the answer yet. After his Washington speech, King became famous all over the world. When people thought of the fight for civil rights in America, they thought of Martin Luther King. In 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his civil rights work. He was only 35 years old, the youngest person, and only the second American ever to win this important prize. At the end of 1964, Time magazine named him Man of the Year. King's work continued. In the South, very few black leaders were elected to government. Before people could vote, they had to register. Very few blacks did this because it was very difficult. In Mississippi, for example, only 7% of blacks were registered to vote. King realized that he had to get blacks to register and then vote. That was the best way to change the segregation laws in the South. Registering black voters was difficult in many states, but Alabama was one of the worst. More than 300,000 blacks in this state wanted to vote, but were not registered. King was asked to help black voters to register in Selma, Alabama. Selma was a small town of 30,000 people. Half of the people in Selma were black, but only 1% of them were registered to vote. If blacks wanted to register to vote, they had to pass a reading test. Almost all failed the test, although they could often read better than the whites who gave them the test. To register, blacks had to go to an office that was only open twice a month. The white people who worked in the office arrived late and left early. When blacks tried to register, they were often told to go away. King and the SCLC planned a protest march from Selma to Montgomery, 50 miles away. Montgomery was the state capital, and it was in this city that the arrest of Rosa Parks has started the battle for civil rights. The march started on the 7th of March. Police met the marchers on the road to Montgomery and told them to go back. When the marchers refused, the police attacked them. They beat the protesters, and one man was killed. Once again, people all over the world were shocked by police violence against peaceful protesters. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the Selma police to protect the marchers. On the 21st of March, the march from Selma to Montgomery started again. It took 5 days, but this time there was no violence. When the march entered Montgomery, there were 25,000 marchers, black and white. The leader of the Alabama government, George Wallace, refused to meet the marchers or listen to their protests. But the message of the marchers reached the government in Washington. Later that year, Martin Luther King was there when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Law of 1964. This law protected the rights of all Americans to vote, and it was one of the most important laws of Martin Luther King's life. It made a big difference to blacks in the South. In 1963, only 6% of blacks in the South were registered to vote. By 1969, 66% were registered. Now no one could stop blacks from voting for their own leaders. Chapter 11. I'm Black and I'm Proud. The 1960s were a time of great change in America. Young people all over America were asking questions about their country. They did not always believe what their parents believed. They wanted change. At the March on Washington, a young singer called Bob Dylan put the thoughts of young Americans into his song, "The Times They Are A-Changin'." "Things are changing fast," the song said. "The old must listen to the young, and they cannot stop change." Young blacks did not want to wait patiently for change. Although they knew that Martin Luther King had worked hard for equal rights, they thought that change was happening too slowly. They wanted power for black people, and they did not want to ask politely for it. Perhaps violence was necessary for change, they thought. In 1966, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton started the Black Panther Party. The Panthers did not agree with Martin Luther King about the use of nonviolence. They said that blacks should buy guns to protect themselves from attacks by whites. Huey Newton said that the Civil Rights Law of 1964 was too little, too late. After a fight between the Panthers and the police, Newton was arrested and put into prison because he killed a white police officer. Crowds of Panther supporters marched through the streets shouting, "Free Huey!" Other Panthers died in battles with the police. Most white Americans were afraid of the Black Panthers. They thought that they were violent criminals. But the Panthers also did some good work. They opened schools in poor black neighborhoods and gave food and clothes to blacks. After a few years, the Black Panther Party broke into smaller groups, but its message reached many young African Americans and made them proud to be black. They started to learn about Africa, eat African food, and wear African clothes. Another person who wanted a different America for blacks was Malcolm X. In the past, many blacks had the name of their slave owner as their last name, so Malcolm changed his last name from Little to X. For him, it was a way of saying goodbye to slavery. Like the Black Panthers, Malcolm X did not agree with Martin Luther King about the use of violence. Blacks should not ask for help from whites, he thought. Blacks should help themselves. Violence was necessary when you were fighting for your rights. Malcolm said that blacks should fight violence with violence. It was the only language that white racists understood. "If a man speaks the language of violence," said Malcolm, "you can't speak to him in the language of peace. He'll break you in two. If a man speaks French, you can't speak to him in German. You have to find out what this man speaks. Once you know his language, learn how to speak his language. Then we can talk." Many young blacks agreed with Malcolm X more than with Martin Luther King. They were angry that they still did not have the same rights as whites. Poor blacks living in the big cities of the North wanted to vote, but they wanted other things too. They wanted better houses and more jobs. In many of the poorer neighborhoods of America's big cities, young blacks rioted. Many people died in these riots. In the 60s, many important black writers and musicians became famous in America. Writers like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison showed Americans what the lives of black people were like. In his book, The Fire Next Time, Baldwin warned of terrible violence in the future. To stop this, whites must change their ways, he said. The black musician, Stevie Wonder, sang about the difficulties of young blacks. One of his songs told the story of a young boy who was born in the South but moved to Chicago to find work. He finds that in the North he is free, but free only to be poor. Why was anyone surprised that young blacks were angry? Perhaps the most famous black man in the 1960s was the boxer Muhammad Ali. Born Cassius Marcellus Clay in 1942 in Louisville, Kentucky, young Clay won an Olympic gold medal in 1960. He fought the world champion Sonny Liston in 1964, and to the surprise of most people, Clay won. After the fight, he surprised the world when he said that he had become a Muslim and had changed his name to Muhammad Ali. "Don't call me Cassius Clay," he said. "That's a slave name." Ali was loud and proud and clever. "I am the greatest," he said. And he was. No one could beat him. He began to speak out against racism. In 1967, he refused to join the U.S. Army and fight in Vietnam. Because of this, he was put in prison, and he was told that he was not the world champion anymore. When he got out of prison, he beat George Foreman to become world champion again. Ali said, "When I refused to fight in Vietnam, I wasn't a hero. I just wanted to be free. I wanted America to be America."